$600? Do you even know who I am, little girl? I could buy your entire neighborhood with what I spend on lunch." The billionaire's voice echoed through the ballroom. Rachel's hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't step back. She lifted her chin and met his cold gaze. "I speak Dutch, sir, and that's my price." Richard Hale's face twisted with contempt. He snapped his fingers at security. "Get this street kid out of my sight, now!" The crowd stirred. Executives whispered behind their hands. A woman in pearls shook her head in disgust. "Where's her mother? Who let her in here?" But before the guards could reach her, Rachel did something that made the entire room fall silent, and Richard Hale's arrogant smile vanished forever. What happened next will stay with you long after this story ends. Subscribe and watch until the very last word. 3 hours before that moment, Rachel Lewis sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the rain tap against the window of their small apartment. The building was old, with cracks running along the ceiling like rivers on a map. But Rachel didn't mind. This was home. On her nightstand sat an old radio, its brown plastic faded from years of use. It had belonged to her father. Every night before bed, she turned the dial, searching for foreign stations. French news from Montreal, German broadcasts that drifted in after midnight, Spanish programs from Miami. And sometimes, if she was lucky, a Dutch channel that came through like a whisper from another world. Her father had taught her to listen, not just to hear, but to truly listen, to catch the rhythm of a language, the melody hidden inside words. He used to say that every language had its own heartbeat, and once you found it, the words would follow. Marcus Lewis had been a freelance interpreter before he died. He spoke 7 languages fluently and could manage 5 more in basic conversation. His small bookshelf, now sitting in the corner of Rachel's room, held dictionaries in Dutch, German, French, and Spanish. Dog-eared pages, handwritten notes in the margins. These were his treasures, and now they were hers. He passed away when Rachel was 6, a heart attack, sudden and cruel. One morning he was teaching her how to say good morning in Dutch, and by evening he was gone. She remembered his voice more than his face now. The way he pronounced words, slow and careful, like each one mattered. After his death, Rachel made herself a promise. She would learn every language he knew. She would carry his voice inside her own. By age 7, she had started teaching herself from his books. By 9, she could read French newspapers. By 11, she was helping her mother with work documents that came home in stacks every night. Now, at 12, she spoke 5 languages with near-perfect fluency. English, French, German, Spanish, and Dutch. Dutch was her favorite. It was the language her father loved most, the one he called the language of patience and precision. It was also the rarest, the one nobody expected a 12-year-old black girl from a poor neighborhood to know. Her mother, Grace Lewis, worked at a translation company downtown. Not as a translator, though. Grace answered phones, filed paperwork, and delivered documents. She worked long hours for little pay, often bringing home extra files to process at night, just to make ends meet. Rachel helped her every evening. She would sit at the kitchen table, a stack of documents between them, and read through contracts, business letters, and technical reports in languages her mother couldn't understand. Grace would watch her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. Pride because Rachel was extraordinary. Worry because extraordinary didn't pay the rent. And the rent was the problem. The night before, Rachel had been lying in bed when she heard her mother's voice through the thin walls. Grace was on the phone, her voice tight with desperation. "Please, just one more week. I'll have the money, I promise. $600. I just need a few more days." The landlord's response was muffled, but Rachel heard enough. If they didn't pay by Friday, they would have to leave. $600 stood between them and the street. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her father's books, thinking about the languages living inside her head, thinking about $600. The next afternoon, Grace received an urgent call from work. A major conference was happening at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel downtown. Important documents needed to be delivered immediately. Her supervisor was sick, and Grace was the only one available. "I'm sorry, baby," Grace said, grabbing her coat. "I have to go. There's no one to watch you, so you'll have to come with me. Just stay quiet and don't touch anything, okay?" Rachel nodded. She put on her best dress, a simple blue one with a small tear near the hem that she had sewn herself. She braided her hair the way her father used to, 2 neat rows close to her scalp. Then she followed her mother out the door. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel was unlike anything Rachel had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 3 stories high. Men in suits that cost more than her mother's yearly salary walked past without a glance. Women in silk dresses and diamond earrings spoke in hushed, important tones. Rachel felt small. Not just physically small, but invisible. Like she didn't belong in this world of marble floors and golden light. Grace delivered the documents to a conference room on the 12th floor. A young assistant named Derek took the papers, barely looking at them. He seemed distracted, his eyes darting toward the main ballroom down the hall. "What's happening?" Grace asked, noticing the tension. Derek shook his head. "Disaster. The biggest deal of the year and everything's falling apart," he explained quickly. Richard Hale, the billionaire CEO of Hale Energy Corporation, was negotiating an $80 million partnership with Henrik Vanderberg, a Dutch renewable energy magnate. Vanderberg had one strict rule for major negotiations. He only spoke Dutch. It was his way of testing whether partners were serious enough to accommodate him. The company had hired a Dutch interpreter, one of the best in the country. But 30 minutes ago, she had been in a car accident on the highway. She was alive, but couldn't make it, and no one else in the building spoke Dutch. Vanderberg had already announced he would leave in 10 minutes if no interpreter arrived. $80 million was about to walk out the door. "Can't they find someone else?" Grace asked. Derek laughed bitterly. "Dutch? In 10 minutes? This isn't Spanish or French. There might be 3 people in this city who can interpret Dutch at a business level, and none of them are answering their phones." Rachel listened quietly from behind her mother. Her heart began to beat faster. Dutch. She knew Dutch. She had spent 5 years learning it from her father's books, from late-night radio programs, from documents her mother brought home. She had translated Dutch contracts just last month, technical papers about energy systems and environmental regulations. She knew Dutch, but she was 12. She was wearing a torn dress. She was nobody. Grace thanked Derek and turned to leave, pulling Rachel toward the elevator. But Rachel's feet wouldn't move. She stood frozen, staring down the hallway toward the ballroom where she could hear raised voices and frustrated shouts. $600. That's all they needed. $600 to keep their home. "Rachel, come on," Grace said, tugging her daughter's hand. But Rachel was thinking about her father, about what he always said. "Your value doesn't come from what people give you. It comes from knowing what you're worth." She knew what she was worth. She knew what she could do. Before she could stop herself, Rachel pulled her hand free and walked toward the ballroom. Grace called after her, confused, then frightened. But Rachel kept walking. The ballroom was chaos. Men in expensive suits argued in clusters. Richard Hale stood at the center, his face red with frustration, barking orders at assistants who had no solutions to offer. At the far end of the room, Henrik Vanderberg sat calmly at a long table, checking his watch with the patience of a man who had already made up his mind to leave. Rachel walked straight through the crowd. People barely noticed her at first. She was just a child, out of place, probably lost. But then she reached the center of the room and stopped directly in front of Richard Hale. He looked down at her with irritation. "Who let this kid in here? Someone get her out." Rachel didn't move. She looked up at the billionaire, at his cold eyes and expensive suit, and the power radiating from every inch of him. Then she spoke, her voice clear and steady. "I can translate. I speak Dutch." Hale stared at her. For a moment, he seemed unsure if this was a joke. "You speak Dutch," he repeated flatly. "Yes, sir." "And how much do you want for this service?" Rachel thought about the phone call, about her mother's desperate voice, about the number that haunted her dreams. $600. The room went silent. Then Richard Hale began to laugh. His laughter filled the ballroom like thunder. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had spent 30 years building an empire and had never once been challenged by someone so small, so poor, so utterly beneath him. $600, Hale repeated, wiping his eyes. "Did everyone hear that? This child wants $600 to save my $80 million deal." The room erupted. Executives in tailored suits chuckled behind their hands. Assistants exchanged amused glances. Even the security guards by the door couldn't suppress their smirks. Grace pushed through the crowd, her face burning with shame. She grabbed Rachel's arm, her fingers trembling. "I'm so sorry," Grace said to no one in particular, to everyone. "She didn't mean it. She's just a child. We'll leave right now." She pulled at Rachel, trying to drag her toward the exit. But Rachel's feet stayed planted on the marble floor. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at the laughing crowd. Her eyes remained fixed on Richard Hale. $600, Hale said, stepping closer to Rachel. He towered over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "Do you know who I am, little girl? I could buy your entire neighborhood with what I spend on lunch. And you think you're worth $600? Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her mother's grip tightening on her arm, could hear the desperation in Grace's whispered pleas. Every instinct told her to run, to apologize, to disappear into the crowd and pretend this never happened. But then she thought of her father, of his voice in the quiet hours of the night, teaching her words in languages she couldn't yet understand, of his hands turning the pages of worn dictionaries, of his promise that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take from her. She turned away from Hale and looked at Henrik Vanderberg, who sat at the far end of the room with his arms crossed, watching the scene with detached curiosity. Then Rachel spoke in Dutch. Her pronunciation was flawless, her accent precise, carrying the careful rhythm her father had taught her. "Mijnheer Vanderberg, wilt u $80 miljoen verliezen omdat zij niemand kunnen vinden om met u te praten?" The words hung in the air. Mr. Vanderberg, do you want to lose $80 million because they can't find anyone to talk to you? The laughter died instantly. Vanderberg straightened in his chair. His eyes narrowed as he studied the small girl standing in the middle of the room. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. He responded in Dutch, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "Meisje, waar heb je Nederlands geleerd?" "Where did you learn Dutch?" Rachel answered without hesitation. "Van mijn vader. Hij zei dat dit de taal van geduld en precisie was. From my father. He said this was the language of patience and precision." Vanderberg's smile widened. He turned to Richard Hale, switching to heavily accented English. "I accept this girl. She speaks better Dutch than your last 3 interpreters combined." He checked his watch. "We begin now, or I leave." Hale's face had gone pale. He looked from Vanderberg to Rachel, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. This wasn't supposed to happen. A child from the streets wasn't supposed to walk into his negotiation and take control. But $80 million hung in the balance, and Henrik Vanderberg was already pulling out his chair. "Fine," Hale said through clenched teeth. He pointed at Rachel. "But if you make one mistake, one single error, I will personally ensure you and your mother never work in this city again." Rachel nodded. "I won't make a mistake." Grace stood frozen near the wall, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know whether to be terrified or proud. Her daughter, her 12-year-old baby, was about to interpret a multi-million-dollar business negotiation. The meeting began. Vanderburg spoke in rapid Dutch, outlining his terms for the renewable energy partnership. He discussed infrastructure investments, carbon emission targets, technology transfers, and profit-sharing arrangements. His language was dense with technical terminology, legal jargon, and financial concepts that would challenge even experienced interpreters. Rachel translated every word. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. Her voice remained steady as she converted Vanderburg's Dutch into precise English, capturing not just the words but the intent behind them. When Vanderburg made a subtle joke about American business practices, she translated the humor. When he expressed concern about long-term commitments, she conveyed his skepticism. When he laid out his non-negotiable conditions, she made his firmness absolutely clear. Hale responded, and Rachel reversed the process with equal fluency. She transformed his aggressive negotiating tactics into Dutch, softening nothing, preserving every demand and counteroffer exactly as he intended. The room watched in stunned silence. Assistants who had laughed at her 5 minutes ago now stared with open mouths. Executives who had dismissed her as a joke exchanged bewildered glances. Even the security guards had stepped closer to watch. But Richard Hale wasn't watching Rachel's skill. He was watching something else entirely. As the negotiation continued, Hale found his attention drifting away from the business terms. He found himself studying the girl's face, the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she stood straight despite the weight of the room pressing down on her. She reminded him of someone. The memory came unbidden, rising from a place he had buried long ago. A small apartment in South Boston decades ago. Peeling wallpaper, a kitchen table covered with fabric scraps, and a woman bent over a sewing machine, working through the night to finish dresses that wealthy women would wear to parties she could never attend. Martha Hale, his mother. She had raised him alone after his father walked out. She worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. She never complained. She never asked for charity. She never accepted less than what she earned. He remembered sitting at that kitchen table watching her sew, asking why they couldn't just ask someone for help. She had looked at him with those tired, fierce eyes and said, "You don't need anyone to give you opportunities, Richard. You create them with your own value. Never let anyone tell you what you're worth. You decide that yourself." He had believed her then. He had carried those words with him through college, through his first job, through the years of building his company from nothing. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten them. He had become the kind of man his mother would not recognize. A man who measured worth in dollar signs. A man who laughed at children for daring to know their own value. He looked at Rachel again. She was still translating, her voice never wavering, her eyes sharp with focus. She was 12 years old, wearing a dress with a torn hem, standing in a room full of millionaires. And she was not afraid. She was everything he used to be, everything he had lost. The negotiation concluded successfully. Vanderburg stood shaking hands with Hale, praising the deal and the unexpected interpreter who had made it possible. "This girl is remarkable," Vanderburg said to Hale. "You should hire her permanently." Rachel allowed herself a small smile, but she didn't celebrate. She simply stood quietly, waiting for what came next. The room began to empty. Executives filed out, already making phone calls to report the successful deal. Vanderburg departed with his assistants, nodding once at Rachel as he passed. Soon, only 3 people remained in the ballroom. Richard Hale, Rachel, and Grace, who still stood near the wall, afraid to move. Hale reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He counted out a thick stack of bills and held them toward Rachel. $6,000, he said. You earned more than what you asked for. Take it. Rachel looked at the money. It was more than she had ever seen in her life, more than her mother earned in months. It could pay their rent for almost a year. She shook her head. I only need $600. That was my price. Hale's expression flickered with something she couldn't read. Don't be foolish. $6,000 could change your life. $600 will save my home, Rachel replied. That's all I asked for. That's all I'll take. You're turning down $5,400? Do you understand how ridiculous that is? Rachel met his gaze. I understand perfectly. I told you my price before we started. You agreed to it. Now I expect you to honor it. Hale stared at her. In 30 years of business, no one had ever refused his money. People begged him for investments, for donations, for sponsorships. They flattered him, manipulated him, did whatever it took to get more from him. This child wanted less. Why? He demanded. The word came out harder than he intended, almost angry. Why won't you take it? Rachel considered the question. Then she answered with words that weren't entirely her own. My father used to say that when someone gives you more than you asked for, you have to ask yourself why. He said that people who give to control aren't really giving. They're buying. She looked at the stack of bills in his hand. I'm not for sale, Mr. Hale. I sold you my skill for 1 hour. The price was $600. Nothing more. The words hit Richard Hale like a physical blow. He heard his mother's voice in his head, saying almost the same thing. Your worth isn't determined by what others pay you. It's determined by knowing what you're worth and never accepting less. He had spent 30 years accepting more. More money, more power, more influence. He had convinced himself that accumulation was success, that wealth was victory. But standing here, looking at this child who wanted nothing from him except basic fairness, he realized the truth. He had been buying people his entire adult life, buying their loyalty, buying their respect, buying their silence. He had become so accustomed to transactions that he had forgotten what genuine integrity looked like. And here it was, 12 years old, wearing a torn dress, asking for exactly what she was owed. His hand began to shake. You don't understand, he said, and his voice cracked. I'm trying to help you. I didn't ask for help, Rachel said gently. I asked for payment. There's a difference. Hale felt something breaking inside him. A wall he had built over decades, brick by brick, to protect himself from the memory of who he used to be. He had buried his mother so deep that he rarely thought of her anymore. He had missed her funeral because he was closing a deal. He had never visited her grave. And now this child, this stranger, was tearing down everything he had built to hide from that shame. My mother, he started, but the word caught in his throat. He tried again. My mother was like you. Rachel said nothing. She simply waited. She never took charity, never asked for more than she earned. She died thinking I would be someone she could be proud of. He drew a ragged breath. I don't think she would recognize me now. Grace stepped forward, suddenly protective. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could see the billionaire crumbling in front of her daughter, and it frightened her. Rachel, we should go, Grace said quietly, but Rachel didn't move. She watched Richard Hale with eyes that seemed far older than 12. My father said that it's never too late to become who you were supposed to be, she said. Maybe your mother would say the same thing. Hale closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Richard Hale stood in the center of the empty ballroom, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the stack of bills he still held. $6,000, a meaningless sum to a man of his wealth. Yet somehow, this child had made him feel like he was the one who couldn't afford something. He couldn't afford her respect. He couldn't buy her admiration. And for the first time in decades, he couldn't purchase his way out of the truth. Slowly, he peeled 6 bills from the stack, $100 each. He folded them neatly and held them out to Rachel. $600, he said quietly. As agreed. Rachel took the money. She didn't count it. She didn't need to. She simply folded the bills and tucked them into the pocket of her worn blue dress. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." There was no triumph in her voice, no gloating, just simple gratitude for a fair transaction completed. Hale put the remaining bills back in his wallet. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man moving through water. Something fundamental had shifted inside him, and he was still trying to understand what it was. He turned to Grace, who stood near the wall with tears still drying on her cheeks. She looked terrified, confused, and proud all at once, a mother watching her daughter do something impossible. "Mrs. Lewis," Hale said, and his voice had lost its sharp edge, "I'd like to speak with you next week. My company is looking for people with genuine ability, not just impressive credentials. I think you might be surprised by what opportunities are available." Grace blinked, uncertain how to respond. "I'm just an assistant. I answer phones and deliver documents." "You raised this child," Hale said simply. "That tells me more about your capabilities than any resume ever could." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, plain white, with only his name and a phone number printed in black ink. He placed it in Grace's hand. "Call my office Monday morning. Ask for my personal assistant and tell her I requested a meeting with you." He glanced at Rachel. "Both of you, if you'd like." Grace stared at the card as if it might vanish at any moment. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" Hale considered the question. A week ago, he would have said something about investment potential or corporate image. He would have framed it as a business decision, a calculated move that served his interests. But that wasn't the truth, and he was tired of lying. "Because your daughter just reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago," he said. "Consider it me paying a debt I didn't know I owed." He turned back to Rachel. The girl stood calmly, her hands clasped in front of her, watching him with those steady, knowing eyes. She looked so small in the vast ballroom, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Yet somehow, she was the largest presence in the room. Hale did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. His expensive suit touched the cold marble floor, and he didn't care. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When you walked in here, I laughed at you. I dismissed you because you were young, because you were poor, because I thought I knew what value looked like." His voice grew thick. "I was wrong." Rachel listened without interrupting. "My mother," Hale continued, "she raised me alone. She worked herself to exhaustion so I could have a chance. She taught me that integrity mattered more than money, that character was worth more than wealth." He drew an unsteady breath. "And I forgot all of it. I became exactly the kind of man she warned me about." A tear slipped down his weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "She died believing I would be someone worthy of her sacrifice. I've spent 30 years proving her wrong." He looked into Rachel's eyes. "But you, standing here today, refusing to be bought, refusing to be anything less than exactly who you are. My mother would have been so proud of you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of regret. Rachel was quiet for a moment, considering what to say. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but certain. "Maybe she'd be proud of you too, if you started again." Hale's composure finally broke. A sob escaped his chest, raw and unexpected. He pressed a hand to his mouth, trying to contain the flood of emotion that overwhelmed him. He had built empires. He had negotiated with presidents and kings. He had controlled billions of dollars and commanded thousands of employees. But in this moment, brought to his knees by the simple wisdom of a 12-year-old girl, he felt like a child again, lost, broken, desperate to find his way back to who he used to be. Rachel stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She placed her small hand on Richard Hale's shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "My dad said that the hardest part of changing is admitting you need to. You already did that." Hale looked up at her, his eyes red and swimming with tears. For a moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man who had lost his way, being guided back by an unexpected light. "Thank you," he whispered. Rachel nodded once. Then she stepped back, took her mother's hand, and smiled. "We should go home, Mom. We have rent to pay." Grace laughed through her tears, pulling Rachel into a tight embrace. She looked at Hale one more time, this powerful man kneeling on the floor with tears streaming down his face, and she understood that something profound had happened here, something that went far beyond money or business deals. "Thank you," Grace said to him, "for seeing her." Hale rose slowly to his feet. He straightened his jacket, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and nodded. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you for raising her." Mother and daughter walked out of the ballroom hand in hand. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor, growing fainter until they disappeared into the grand lobby of the hotel. Richard Hale stood alone in the empty room for a long time, staring at the door they had walked through. That night, Rachel sat with her mother at their small kitchen table. The $600 lay between them, crisp bills against the worn wood. Grace kept touching them, as if making sure they were real. "I can't believe you did that," Grace said for the 100th time. "I can't believe any of this happened." Rachel smiled. "Dad always said that knowing your worth was the most powerful thing in the world. I think I finally understand what he meant." Grace pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her close. Outside their window, the city hummed with its usual noise. Cars honked, sirens wailed, neighbors argued through thin walls. Everything was the same as it had always been, but something had changed. In their small apartment, with $600 on the table and a business card tucked safely in Grace's pocket, something new had begun. Not a fairy tale ending, not a sudden transformation from poverty to wealth. Just a door, slightly open, letting in a crack of light. Rachel rested her head against her mother's shoulder and listened to the rain tap against the window, the same sound she had heard that morning, a lifetime ago. "Mom," she said quietly, "do you think Dad would be proud?" Grace kissed the top of her daughter's head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Baby," she whispered, "I think he's been proud of you every single day." And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, Rachel could almost hear her father's voice, warm and certain, speaking words she would carry with her forever. "You decide your own worth. Never let anyone tell you otherwise."